I call the Honourable Ruth Dyson.
Thank you very much,
Mr.
Speaker. I found that a really muddled speech from the Minister of Conservation, and it does lead me to the conclusion that actually this is not a serious consideration about the needs of West Coast people. And by crikey, do I ever hear that representation regularly from Damien O'Connor as he tells me and other colleagues about the battering that the West Coast has had to endure under this government that is totally out of touch with the needs and reality of people. But the Minister of Conservation, I think, is playing a cheap political stunt game with this legislation. He had the audacity to say to the House, why would you let fallen trees rot on the ground? Actually, because it's been in the Conservation Act for 27 years, has had enduring support from this Parliament, and he is the Minister of Conservation who's responsible for implementing the Conservation Act. So it just made a nonsense of him in his position. But that's not the first time, actually. That minister has stood alongside his colleagues and said, we have to balance the economy with the environment. We always have to have this balance. That's why when the Minister of Conservation is making decisions about mining on conservation land, he no longer has that authority himself. He has to share it with the Minister of Energy and Resources. What a nonsense. That dual decision-making puts the Minister of Conservation right out of the loop in the traditional role as being an advocate for conservation, and his speech confirmed that today. If this was urgent legislation to give a commitment to West Coast people that they would have better employment, good jobs, well-paid jobs in their local community, we would certainly back it. But that's not what the government is proposing, and the Minister of Conservation actually confirmed that when he answered a question from Damien O'Connor in the House yesterday. He started talking about a sawmill in Nelson, which could benefit from this. That was a little different, totally flip-flop, a little different than the commitment he gave to the West Coasters, that this was about them and their jobs. No such commitment is in the legislation. Mr. Speaker, I want to talk about the other points that Labor has raised with the government. Oh, and by the way, we haven't had a response. This is so urgent that the Prime Minister can't even be bothered responding to another political party on the points that they have raised with it. Let me go through with it, I'm sure. Let me go through those points. I'm sure that the Leader of the House, who's going to take the next call, will respond to some of them and explain why we haven't even had the courtesy of a response from the Prime Minister. The first point is that 3 months after the event, 3 months after this event, which caused such terrible results for the West Coast, not just for the forests, but for individuals' homes and property, just the most destructive force we have seen for many years, other than obviously the earthquakes. 3 months after, Nick Smith says we're going to have this bill not just introduced, not with a truncated select committee process, not with any consideration of the actual time that's required to get logging permits out. We're going to ram this bill through all stages under urgency. I know it's the National Party conference starting on Friday night, so they don't care if they're stuck in Wellington. It might actually be a very generous way of saving taxpayers' money by not enabling them to commute home tomorrow and come back on Friday night. There is no need for urgency on this, and if there was some time constraint, we put it in writing that we would support a truncated select committee process. If West Coasters are so important, Mr Sabin and Mr Okenvold, give them a chance to have a say. Give them a chance to have a say through a select committee process. This is a cheap political stunt, not a serious commitment to the West Coast. So that's the first point, justify this outrageous use of urgency through all stages without anyone having an opportunity to have a say. There is no commitment, despite what the Minister of Conservation said, there is no commitment to make sure that any jobs that are a result of this legislation go to West Coasters. So that was the second point that we made. There is no need for the 5-year time frame of this, and we proposed a 2-year time frame that would be more than adequate. This bill doesn't say that there will be a truncated process of consideration under the Resource Management Act. It says the Resource Management Act does not apply. So there could be wholesale environmental degradation with no comeback because the law says those specific sections of the Resource Management Act do not apply. It's in the legislation, and if you are arguing about it, Dr. Smith, read the bill. It's in your name. It's a total embarrassment to have the Minister of Conservation charged under statute with protecting our most precious land and surrounds, and he says, oh, but don't worry about the Resource Management Act. Destroy the environment, destroy the rivers, do what you like, because it's so urgent and so important. So we said that it was not appropriate to absolutely remove any provisions of protection of the Resource Management Act. We wanted some consideration given to the people whose livelihoods currently depend on the legal milling of Indigenous trees. They're not doing all that well. We know there are stockpiles. We know that they haven't got a booming business. What does the flooding of the market with trees under this legislation do to people who have a legitimate business already? What does it do to them? I know that the National Party is all keen on market forces. This changes the rules totally for those people who already have a legitimate business, and they are very unhappy about that. And what about the people who worked so hard to get their rights under SILNA finally determined? What does it do to them? Bit of silence from the National Party. It's a pleasant change, but they don't give a toss, actually, about the livelihoods of existing West Coast business people who fought to get their businesses going, who have been acting inside the law, who are struggling for both beach and Remu. There are existing businesses. Chris Ockenvold doesn't even know who they are. That's extraordinary. Existing businesses who have permits will have their competition flooded as a result of this legislation. So existing businesses threatened rather than having their workforce enhanced. And the final point I want to make, Mr. Speaker, is that the maps that are supposed to describe the areas that will be available for logging on the West Coast in this bill should be included in the legislation. If you're going to go through all stages of a bill under urgency, and gosh, we've seen some problems from Nick Smith in terms of legislation rammed through and with inappropriate use of ministerial powers before. This wouldn't be the first time by any means. We want to try and make a bad bill better. It should have the scrutiny of a select committee. It should have the maps that describe the areas from which logs will be able to be taken as part of the legislation, not as an add-on. So there are some quite fundamental problems with this legislation, but I saw the pretty picture in the paper. If somebody paid $6,500 for that picture, the Department of Conservation paid $6,500 for the picture of Peter Dunn, Te Urara Flavel and Dr. Nick Smith sitting surrounded by felled trees. I think they should ask for a refund. It was pretty awful. Actually, you could have done a better one on your smartphone, Dr. Smith. You could have done a selfie. $6,500 for a photo opportunity just 3 months out from an election. What does that say about the cynicism of the National Party? What does that say about the desperation of the Honourable Peter Dunn and Te Urara Flavel from the Māori Party, that they will travel all that way in order to get a photo op with the Minister. Mr Brownlee, when you take the call, please give us the courtesy of responding to the letter. We've had no response at all from the Prime Minister, and it's not good enough.
Speaker.
I call the Honourable Minister, Jerry Brownlee.
Mr Speaker, I can't